A janitor, Madeline Shaw repeated, letting the word hang in the air between them like a bad smell. She picked up her wine glass, her manicured nails tapping against the crystal. I see. So, while I spend my days building a global empire, you spend your nights polishing the floors it's built on. Tyler Holt met her gaze without flinching, the sting of her words dulled by years of practice. It's a steady job, he said, his voice even. It means I'm always there to pick up my daughter, Daisy, from school. That's what matters. Madeline gave a tight, dismissive smile, her eyes already scanning the restaurant for her escape. Of course, she said, her tone making it clear she thought the opposite. A family man. She placed a credit card on the table with an air of finality, ending the disastrous date and, with it, any thought of the man sitting across from her. The waiter, sensing the Arctic shift in the atmosphere, hurried over. Is everything all right, Miss Shaw? Perfectly fine, Arthur. The evening has just reached its natural conclusion. She stood, the silk of her blouse whispering as she smoothed it down. The garment probably cost more than Tyler's monthly rent. Her gaze performed a final, cold sweep over him. Our mutual friend Chloe has a rather eclectic sense of humor. Now Tyler understood the setup. Chloe had been evasive about what Madeline did for a living, describing her only as a force of nature. To Madeline, Chloe had described him as grounded, a man who was solid to the core. Both descriptions were true, but they were truths from different universes. Chloe, in a naive and hopeful gesture, had omitted their professions, hoping they might connect as people before their statuses built a wall between them. The gesture had just backfired in spectacular fashion. Chloe means well, Tyler said, the words tasting like sawdust. Perhaps. Madeline's attention was already gone, captured by the vibrating phone in her hand. A string of notifications lit up the screen, pulling her back into a world of market fluctuations and hostile takeovers. Enjoy your janitorial duties, Tyler. She turned and walked away without a second look, her heels clicking a sharp, authoritative rhythm on the polished floor. Tyler sat alone at the table, the half-eaten bread basket and 2 glasses of expensive wine looking like relics from a failed treaty negotiation. He wasn't angry. Anger was a luxury, an energy better spent on packing Daisy's lunch or fixing a squeaky floorboard. What he felt was a familiar, bone-deep weariness of being measured against a ruler he had no interest in using. He picked up the bill, slid Madeline's platinum card back to her side of the table, and pulled his own worn leather wallet from his back pocket. He'd learned long ago not to accept a thing from people who looked down on him. After paying, he walked out into the cool night air. The city was a glittering web of light and ambition. He dialed the number that mattered most. Everything okay, dear? Mrs. Gable's voice was a warm blanket. Everything's fine, Tyler lied smoothly. Date's over. How's Daisy? Any trouble? Not a peep. She's fast asleep, dreaming of dragons, I imagine. You have a good one, Tyler. A real angel. A genuine smile finally touched his lips. Yeah, she is. I'm heading to my shift now. I'll see you in the morning. He ended the call as a black town car purred to the curb across the street. Madeline emerged from the restaurant and slid into the back seat, the door closing with a soft, expensive thud. The car melted into the river of headlights. Inside, Madeline's fingers flew across her phone screen, firing off emails. A janitor. Chloe had set her up with a janitor. The sheer absurdity of it was an insult. A familiar coil of restless anger tightened in her gut. It was too early to go back to her sterile penthouse. Sleep was out of the question. Change of destination, she said, her voice sharp. Take me to the Obsidian Point. Work was the only cure for this agitation. She would bury her frustration under a mountain of quarterly reports. An hour later, Tyler swiped his ID card at the service entrance of the same building. The 50-story tower of black glass and steel pierced the night sky, a monument to a world he only serviced. He changed into his gray overalls in the deserted locker room, the familiar scent of industrial cleaner a strange sort of comfort. His life was built on routines, and there was a quiet strength in that. His shift began on the lower levels. The vast, silent lobbies gleamed under his buffer, reflecting a distorted, faceless man in gray. He worked his way up, floor by silent floor. He knew the building's secrets. The service elevators not on the official blueprints, the ventilation ducts big enough to crawl through, the schematics hidden in maintenance closets. He knew its bones. As he reached the 40th floor, he paused, looking out the panoramic windows at the city spread below. From up here, you couldn't tell the difference between a CEO and a janitor. Finally, he reached the 48th floor. The top. A single name was etched in frosted glass on the suite door. Shaw Industries. He wondered if she was up there right now, building her empire. He could almost feel her presence, a hum of restless energy vibrating down through the steel. He shook his head, pushing the thought away. He had a job to do. He was just turning his cart toward the service elevator when a low, deep rumble vibrated through the soles of his boots. It wasn't a sound, more of a feeling. A sudden, violent shudder from the building's core. The lights flickered again, and died, plunging the entire floor into absolute, suffocating darkness. For a heartbeat, there was only silence. Then, a distant, muffled roar echoed up from the depths of the tower. A split second of weightlessness followed the shudder. The emergency lights, designed to kick in during a power failure, flickered on for a brief, hopeful moment before a secondary tremor, sharper this time, shook the tower, and they died with a faint pop. Absolute darkness returned, accompanied by the high-pitched, insistent shriek of a fire alarm. The sound was thin and metallic, a stark contrast to the deep, guttural groan of the building settling around him. Tyler's training slammed into place, overriding any flicker of panic. He dropped to one knee, making himself a smaller target, though he didn't know from what. His senses, long dormant, snapped to high alert. Assess, orient, act. The roar had come from below, deep below, not a gas leak on an upper floor. This was structural. The air, already stale with recycled oxygen, now carried a new scent. Acrid smoke, the sharp tang of burnt wiring, and something else, something chemical, like bitter almonds. He pressed his hand flat against the floor. A steady, low-frequency vibration hummed through the concrete. The building was alive, and it was in pain. Inside her penthouse office, Madeline Shaw was thrown from her chair as the first tremor hit. Her laptop skidded across the vast expanse of her desk, crashing to the floor. "What in God's name?" she muttered, her initial reaction one of pure annoyance. A power surge? In the most technologically advanced building in the city? Unacceptable. She'd have the entire facilities management team fired by dawn. When the darkness fell, her annoyance curdled into confusion. Her office, usually a beacon of light against the night sky, was a black void. Her phone, her lifeline to the world, had no signal. The emergency intercom on her desk, a direct line to security, was dead. She felt her way to the door, her hands tracing the cool, smooth wood until she found the handle. It wouldn't turn. A heavy, metallic thud echoed from the hallway as a fire shutter slammed down, sealing her in. "Hello?" she called out, her voice sounding small and thin in the oppressive silence. "Is anyone out there?" The only answer was the rising shriek of the alarm. A thin gray tendril of smoke curled under the door, ghostly and silent in the faint moonlight filtering through her floor-to-ceiling windows. That's when the fear, cold and sharp, finally pierced through her armor of command and control. She was trapped. In the corridor, Tyler was already moving. He didn't need light. He had walked these halls hundreds of times. He knew every turn, every corner, every alcove. He moved with a practiced economy of motion, one hand trailing along the wall for guidance. The main elevators were death traps. The service elevator he'd just been using was likely out. That left the stairs. He reached the fire escape door, pulling the heavy handle. It opened with a groan of protesting metal. The stairwell was a concrete chute of darkness, but the air was marginally clearer. Down. The only logical direction was down. Get to the ground floor, get outside, get to a phone. He had to call Mrs. Gable. He had to know Daisy was okay. The thought of his daughter was a sharp, physical pain in his chest, a motivator more powerful than any instinct for self-preservation. He started down the stairs, taking them two at a time, his janitor's work boots making soft, rhythmic sounds against the concrete. He descended past the 47th floor, the 46th. The smoke was getting thicker, a choking fog that clawed at the back of his throat. He pulled the collar of his overalls up over his nose and mouth. He reached the 45th floor landing and paused, his hand on the railing. He could hear something now, faint and distant above the alarm. A series of panicked shouts, the sound of someone banging on a metal door. But his focus was singular. Daisy. Get out. Get to Daisy. He took another step down, and then stopped cold. Shaw Industries. The 48th floor. He pictured her face in the restaurant, the casual cruelty in her eyes as she dismissed him. His life. Everything he stood for. She was arrogant, cold, and unpleasant. She wasn't his problem. His problem was an 8-year-old girl sleeping soundly in a warm bed, trusting her father to come home. He took another step down. Leave no man behind. The words echoed in his head, an old creed from a different life, a life of dust and sun, and the shared bond of survival. It was a rule etched into his soul, a principle he'd seen men die for. She wasn't a soldier. This wasn't a battlefield. But she was a person, a life, and she was trapped above him, in the heart of the danger. He stood there in the dark, torn between two duties that were ripping him in half. The father against the soldier. Love against principle. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to go down, to run toward his daughter. Leaving Madeline Shaw to her fate would be easy. It would be logical. It might even feel like a small, bitter form of justice. But it wouldn't be right. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that if he walked out of this building leaving her behind, he wouldn't be the man Daisy deserved as a father. He wouldn't be the man he had forced himself to become. Damn it, he whispered into the smoky darkness. He turned around. The metallic taste of fear and resignation filled his mouth. He began to climb, forcing his legs to move against every instinct, one step at a time, back up into the smoke, back up toward the fire. Back up to the 48th floor. The climb back up was a journey through hell. Each floor he passed was a milestone in his betrayal of a father's first duty. With every step, the air grew hotter, thicker, and more poisonous. The alarm shriek was now punctuated by the groaning of stressed metal and the distant, terrifying sound of shattering glass. The building was tearing itself apart. He reached the 48th floor landing, his lungs burning, his eyes streaming. The smoke here was a solid, roiling thing, an oily black fog that clung to every surface. The main corridor was impassable, a tunnel of blackness where heat shimmered in the air. The fire shutter for the main entrance to Shaw Industries was down, a solid sheet of steel glowing with a faint, ominous heat from the other side. There was no getting through there. But Tyler knew another way. He felt his way along the wall, past the sealed door, counting his steps. 20 paces down, there was a small, almost invisible seam in the wallpaper, a maintenance panel. Behind it was a narrow crawl space that ran parallel to the main corridor, connecting the service closets and ventilation systems. It was designed for running new cables, not for human passage. But he'd been inside it once to fix a faulty sensor. It was tight, but it would go. He pulled a multi-tool from a pouch on his belt, a janitor's best friend, and pried at the edge of the panel. The metal groaned in protest. He put his shoulder into it, muscles straining, until it popped open with a loud crack. Cool, slightly less smoky air washed over his face. He ducked inside, pulling the panel shut behind him, and was plunged back into total darkness. Inside Madeline's office, the heat was becoming unbearable. The smoke was so thick she was on her hands and knees, coughing, her throat raw. She had tried to break one of the massive triple-paned windows with a bronze statue of a bull, an award for a ruthless takeover, but the glass had only starred, refusing to shatter. The city lights mocked her from beyond the impassable barrier. Her $100 million view had become the wall of her tomb. Panic was a wild animal clawing at her insides. All her life, every problem had been solvable with money, power, or intimidation. Now, those tools were useless. She was just a woman in a sealed, superheating box, slowly running out of air. A loud metallic scraping sound echoed from the far wall, near the private kitchenette. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Was the building collapsing? "Madeline!" a voice called out, muffled but clear. "Madeline Shaw, can you hear me?" She stared into the darkness, her mind reeling. It couldn't be. The voice was familiar. "Who's there?" she choked out, her voice raspy. A section of the wall near the floor, disguised as a ventilation grate, was being pushed outward. A dark shape began to emerge. A man covered in soot, wearing gray overalls. It was him, the janitor. "Tyler?" she whispered, the name tasting like ash and disbelief. "What are you doing here?" "Getting you out," he said, his voice calm and authoritative, completely at odds with the chaos around them. He crawled the rest of the way into the room, the multi-tools still in his hand. "We have to move, now! The fire is spreading from the elevator shafts. This whole floor could flash over any minute." Her mind struggled to process the impossibility of it. He should have been one of the first ones out. He should have been running for his life. Instead, he had climbed back up. For her. Why? "How did you get in?" "Service crawl space. Now come on. I need you to follow my instructions exactly. No questions. Can you do that?" He was already moving toward her, his silhouette steady and sure in the gloom. The sheer audacity of it. The janitor giving her, Madeline Shaw, orders, was so jarring that it momentarily cut through her panic. "You expect me to crawl through a vent?" "I expect you to live," he countered, his voice hard. "The choice is yours. You can stay here and die in your corner office, or you can follow me and maybe see the sunrise. The fire doesn't care who you are." He crouched beside her, and for the first time, she could see his eyes in the faint moonlight. They were clear, focused, and held no trace of fear, only resolve. That resolve was more compelling than any argument. It was the only solid thing in a world that was falling apart. She gave a single, jerky nod. "Good. Take off your shoes," he commanded. "My shoes? They're Manolo's. They cost—" "They'll get you killed," he cut her off sharply. "You need to be able to move, and move quietly. Ditch them." She hesitated for a second, then kicked off the designer heels. The act felt like a surrender. "Stay low," he ordered. "The cleaner air is near the floor. We're going back through the crawl space to the stairwell on the north side of the building. It should be clearer. I'm going first. Stay right behind me. Do not stop, no matter what you hear. Got it?" She nodded again, her throat too tight to speak. He led her to the opening. The crawl space was a claustrophobic tunnel of wires and pipes. It was dark, dirty, and terrifying. It was also their only way out. He slipped inside, then turned and reached a hand back for her. She stared at his calloused, grease-stained hand, the same hand she had refused to shake just a few hours ago. Now it was a lifeline. Swallowing her pride, her fear, and the bile rising in her throat, she took it. His grip was strong and sure, pulling her from the suffocating heat of her office into the suffocating darkness of the crawl space. They moved in silence, the only sounds their own ragged breaths and the ominous groans of the building. Tyler led the way, his movements confident and certain. After what felt like an eternity, he stopped at another grate. "Stairwell C," he whispered, "should be here." He pushed the grate open. A wave of cooler, fresher air washed over them. They scrambled out onto the landing of another stairwell. It was still dark, but the smoke was noticeably thinner. "Okay," Tyler said, taking a deep breath. 48 floors to go." He took a step down, then froze. A low, grinding crack echoed from below, a sound of catastrophic failure. The concrete beneath their feet trembled violently. Before he could shout a warning, the entire flight of stairs below them tore away from the wall and plunged into the abyss with a deafening roar, leaving nothing but a gaping, smoky chasm. For a long moment, neither of them moved. They stood frozen on the precipice of nothing, the abyss below them breathing hot, smoky air. The roar of the collapse faded, replaced by the crackle of distant fire and the horrified, strangled sound that escaped Madeline's throat. Her mind, so used to calculating odds and outcomes, finally found a scenario it couldn't process. Complete and utter hopelessness. "We're dead," she whispered, her voice a hollow shell of its former authority. She sank to her knees, the rough concrete scraping her stockings, her body finally surrendering to the terror that had been circling her for the last hour. "It's over. We're trapped." Tyler didn't waste time with comforting lies. He grabbed her by the arm, his grip hard and insistent, and hauled her back to her feet. "Get up," he ordered, his voice a low growl that cut through her despair. "You can die later. Right now, you move." "Move where?" she cried, gesturing wildly at the chasm. "There's nowhere to go." "She's right," he said, looking not at the drop, but at the ceiling. "We don't go down. We go up." She stared at him, bewildered. "Up? To what?" "The roof," he said, his mind already working, processing new variables, formulating a new plan. "There's a helipad. Emergency access. If there are first responders, that's where they'll look first. It gets us out of the smoke and into the open air. It's our only shot." The logic was simple, brutal, and terrifying. To go up, they had to go back into the inferno of the 48th floor, back through the crawl space. "No," Madeline breathed, shaking her head. "I can't. Not back in there." "You can and you will," Tyler said, his face inches from hers. Soot smudged his features, but his eyes were like chips of steel. "I didn't climb 48 floors for you to give up now. We are getting off this roof. Do you understand me?" He wasn't asking. He was telling her. The soldier had taken over completely. She saw something in his eyes then, a deep, unwavering certainty that defied the chaos around them. It was the look of a man who had faced worse and survived. It was the only thing in this entire nightmare that felt real. She gave a numb, trembling nod. "Good. Let's go." He led her back to the crawlspace grate. The heat radiating from the main corridor had intensified. He peered through the opening into her former office. Flames were now licking at the far wall, greedily consuming the expensive leather chairs and polished mahogany. They had maybe minutes before the entire suite was engulfed. "It's going to be hot," he warned. "We have to cross the main floor to get to the central server room. The roof ladder is in there. Stay low and stay right on my heels." They crawled back into the office. The heat was a physical blow, stealing the air from their lungs. Tyler didn't hesitate. He moved in a low crouch, his head on a swivel, scanning the room like a predator. He pointed toward a bank of cubicles. "Through there. It'll give us cover from the worst of the heat." They moved through the maze of the open-plan office, a hellscape of melting computers and burning paperwork. Madeline's world, the one she had built with ruthless precision, was being erased before her eyes. The air was a toxic soup of burning plastic and chemicals. She stumbled, her bare feet slipping on a piece of melted debris. A cry of pain escaped her as a shard of hot plastic sliced into her soul. Tyler was on her in an instant, pulling her behind a large metal filing cabinet. "You hurt?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. "My foot," she gasped, tears of pain and frustration welling in her eyes. Without a word, he ripped a strip of fabric from the sleeve of his own overalls. He knelt, gently took her foot in his hand, and quickly, efficiently, wrapped the wound. The gesture was so unexpectedly tender, so practical in the face of Armageddon, that it stunned her into silence. He wasn't gentle, but he was careful. "It'll hold," he said, pulling her back up. "We're almost there." They reached the server room door. It was a heavy, reinforced steel door with a sleek, dark keypad next to it. No power. The electronic lock was dead. "It's a magnetic lock," Madeline said, her voice hoarse. "We can't open it without power." Tyler ignored her. He was studying the frame, the hinges, the small gap between the door and the wall. Then his eyes landed on a heavy-duty fire extinguisher mounted on the wall nearby. He lifted it from its bracket. It was heavy, a solid steel cylinder. "Stand back," he said. He reversed the extinguisher, gripping the nozzle and hose. He braced himself, then swung the heavy base like a battering ram, aiming for the spot right next to the handle where the maglock was housed. The first blow landed with a deafening clang that echoed through the burning office. The door shuddered but held. "It won't work," Madeline shouted over the din. Tyler didn't listen. He swung again and again. Each blow was precise, powerful, and focused on the exact same spot. Sweat poured down his face, mixing with the soot. He was a machine of pure, focused intent. On the fifth strike, there was a sharp crack of tortured metal. The lock mechanism shattered. The door swung inward into the cool, dark server room. Inside, the air was clean and blessedly cold. The insulated room a sanctuary from the inferno outside. Racks of silent, dead servers stood like monoliths in the darkness. And against the far wall, a simple steel ladder was bolted to the concrete, ascending to a square hatch in the ceiling. "Go," Tyler said, breathing heavily, nudging her toward it. "Get moving." Madeline didn't hesitate. She scrambled up the ladder, her wounded foot throbbing with every step. Tyler was right behind her, his presence a solid, reassuring weight below. She reached the top and pushed against the hatch. It was heavy, but it moved. She pushed it open and clambered out, followed a second later by Tyler. The shock of the cold night air was dizzying. It was real, fresh, and beautiful. She took a deep, ragged breath, then another, coughing as her lungs expelled the smoke. For one glorious, fleeting second, she felt a wave of pure, unadulterated relief. They had made it. They were out. Then she stood up and looked around. The relief shattered into a million pieces. The helipad on the far side of the roof was a wreck. Its surface buckled and twisted from the force of the explosion. Worse, the fire wasn't just below them anymore. It had found a way out. From a massive ventilation shaft near the center of the roof, a thick black pillar of smoke poured into the sky, shot through with angry orange flames. The roof wasn't a refuge. It was the top of a lit torch. The wind whipped across the rooftop, cold and sharp, a stark contrast to the waves of heat rolling off the burning vent. It tore at their clothes and carried the stench of chemical smoke, a smell that scraped the back of the throat. Madeline stared at the pillar of fire, her mind finally, truly breaking. The last vestige of hope, so briefly kindled, was extinguished. "No," she said, the word barely a whisper against the wind. "No, no, no!" She backed away from the edge, her eyes wide with a terror that went beyond the immediate threat. It was the terror of absolute finality. This is it. This is a 50-story coffin. Tyler grabbed her arm before she could retreat into a state of catatonic shock. "Hey, look at me." He forced her to meet his gaze. "I didn't drag you up here to give a eulogy. We're not done." "Done?" she shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. "Look around, Tyler. The helipad is a wreck and the roof is on fire. We have nowhere to go. We are going to burn to death up here." "Then we find another way off," he said, his voice a blade of pure certainty that cut through her panic. He released her and his gaze swept across the rooftop, not as a victim seeing a trap, but as a soldier surveying a battlefield. He cataloged every detail: the air conditioning units, the communication arrays, the raised skylights, the maze of pipes and conduits. And then he saw it. Tucked away near the western edge of the roof, a low, solid, concrete structure. A maintenance shed. "There," he said, pointing. "The BMU." Madeline followed his finger, her expression blank. "The what?" "Building maintenance unit," he clarified, already moving toward it. "The window washing rig." The cradle. A flicker of understanding, and then immediate dismissal, crossed her face. "That's insane. There's no power. It won't work. It'll have a manual override." He shot back over his shoulder, not breaking stride. "It's a safety requirement. A way to get it back to the roof if it loses power mid-operation." "But we don't want to get it back to the roof," she argued, stumbling after him. "We want to get it off. If there's a manual crank to bring it up, we can reverse it to take it down," he said. The logic was simple, desperate, and the only thing they had left. The path to the shed was treacherous. They had to pass within 30 feet of the main vent, which was now spewing embers along with the smoke. The heat was intense, a physical force that blistered the skin. "When I say go, you run." Don't stop until you reach that shed, Tyler commanded, positioning himself between her and the worst of the heat. Ready? Go! He gave her a push and she ran, her bare, bandaged foot screaming in protest. She didn't look back. She could feel the heat scorching her hair, the air so hot it felt like swallowing glass. She threw herself against the cold concrete of the shed, just as Tyler came up behind her, his face grim. The shed door was secured with a heavy-duty padlock. It might as well have been the door to a bank vault. Madeline slumped against the wall, her breath coming in ragged sobs. Locked. Of course it's locked. Tyler didn't answer. He was already working, pulling his multi-tool from his belt. He tried to pick the lock, his fingers surprisingly nimble despite their size, but the mechanism was too complex. Not going to work, he grunted, stepping back. He scanned the door again. His eyes narrowed in concentration. Okay, new plan. He handed her the fire extinguisher he'd used to break down the server room door, which he'd carried with him to the roof. When I get the door open a crack, I need you to wedge the nozzle in as hard as you can. Can you do that? She looked at the extinguisher, then back at him, confused. How are you going to... He was already at the side of the shed, straining against a long steel pipe that was part of the roof's railing system. With a groan of protesting metal, he managed to bend it back and forth until a section, nearly 6 feet long, broke free with a loud crack. It was heavy, but it was a lever. He jammed one end of the pipe into the seam of the door, near the hinges. Get ready, he grunted, putting all his weight on the free end. The steel door moaned, then buckled slightly. A tiny gap appeared. Now, he yelled. Madeline scrambled forward and shoved the extinguisher nozzle into the gap. Good! Hold it there! Tyler repositioned the pipe and levered it again, using the nozzle as a fulcrum. The gap widened with a screech of tortured metal. He did it again, and again. On the 4th try, the lock housing shattered and the door burst open. The inside of the shed was pitch black and smelled of grease and hydraulic fluid. Tyler found a set of emergency torches on a wall bracket and clicked one on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the complex machinery of the window washing rig's housing. A massive steel arm was folded back, with a small 2-person cradle suspended from it by thick steel cables. Okay, Tyler breathed, shining the light on the control panel. It was, as expected, completely dead. Now we find the release. He began searching the machinery, his hands running over gears and levers, his expression one of intense concentration. Madeline watched him, a strange feeling blooming in her chest, pushing past the fear. It was awe. He moved with such purpose, such competence. He was a man in his element, not because he was a CIO or a titan of industry, but because he understood how things worked. He understood failure points and stress tolerances, leverage and mechanics. The world she had dismissed as mundane and insignificant was now the only world that mattered. How do you know this? She asked, her voice quiet. How do you know what to do? He didn't look up from his work. I was a combat engineer in the Army. My job was to build things, fix things, and blow things up. After that, part of being a janitor is knowing how the building breathes. You learn where all the bones are, the parts nobody else ever looks at. His words were not an accusation, but a simple statement of fact, and they landed with more force than any insult. Ah, he said suddenly. Here we are. His light settled on a heavy, recessed wheel with a handle that folded out from its center. Manual crank. This will move the arm. He found another lever nearby, painted bright red. And this should be the brake release. He put his shoulder into the crank and turned. It barely budged. He braced his feet, every muscle in his back and arms straining. Slowly, with an agonizing groan, the massive steel arm began to move, unfolding from its housing and extending out over the edge of the building. Okay, he panted, sweat dripping from his chin. Get in the cradle. Move to the far side. Keep your weight balanced. She climbed into the small metal cage, her heart pounding against her ribs. It felt flimsy, a tiny, insignificant thing dangling over a 50-story drop. Tyler finished positioning the arm, then climbed in after her, his weight making the cradle dip alarmingly. He leaned out, his hand on the red brake lever. This is it, he said, looking at her, his eyes serious. "It's going to be a rough ride. Whatever happens, do not stand up and do not rock the cradle. Understand?" She could only nod, her hands gripping the safety rail so tightly her knuckles were white. Tyler took a deep breath. "Here we go." He pulled the lever. There was a loud clank, and then a stomach-lurching drop of about 5 feet as the slack in the cables went tight. Madeline screamed, her eyes squeezed shut. The cradle swung violently, slamming against the side of the building with a deafening screech of metal on glass. Then, slowly, terrifyingly, it began to descend, scraping its way down the face of the burning skyscraper. The world became a symphony of shrieking metal. The cradle wasn't descending smoothly. It was a controlled fall, a terrifying scrape against the skin of the building. With every floor they passed, the sound of metal grinding against glass and steel was a physical assault. Madeline kept her eyes squeezed shut, her knuckles white bone against the safety rail. The dizzying sight of the city lights wheeling below was too much to bear. She focused on the only 2 solid things in her universe, the feel of the cold steel under her hands and the sound of Tyler's steady breathing beside her. He was a rock in the heart of the storm. He worked the brake lever with a focused precision, his body braced against the side of the cradle, using his own weight to keep the descent from becoming a free fall. The muscles in his forearms were corded with strain. He wasn't looking down at the street, 50 stories below. He was looking up, at the cables, at the arm of the crane, at the burning roof they were leaving behind. He was constantly assessing, anticipating the next failure point. "Open your eyes," he said, his voice calm but firm, not taking his eyes off the cables. "I can't," she breathed, her voice a thin thread of sound. "You have to. I need you to be my lookout on this side. Tell me if you see any debris, anything sticking out from the building that could snag us." It was a command, not a request, and some deeply ingrained part of her, the part that responded to authority, obeyed. She forced her eyes open, blinking back tears. They were passing the 42nd floor. Through the windows, she could see offices twisted into surreal landscapes of fire and shadow. A chair, still burning, was fused to a melted desk. Papers, caught in a thermal updraft, danced like fiery ghosts against the glass. It was a glimpse into the grave they had just escaped. She forced herself to look away from the fire and focus on the sheer face of the building. "It looks clear," she managed to say, her voice trembling. "Good. Keep watching." They descended another 10 floors in an agonizingly slow, jarring procession. The scraping sound was their constant companion. The cradle would lurch, slide, catch, and then lurch again. Each sudden movement sent a fresh spike of adrenaline through Madeline's system. She was operating on pure, frayed nerve endings. "Your daughter," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. She needed to say something, anything, to fill the terrifying silence between the groans of metal. "Daisy, how old is she?" Tyler didn't answer for a moment, his focus absolute as he navigated them past a shattered window on the 30th floor. When the cradle was clear, he finally spoke, his voice low. 8. She's waiting for me to read her a story in the morning." The simple domestic detail was so profoundly out of place in their current reality that it hit Madeline with the force of a physical blow. A story. While they were dangling from a steel thread on the side of a burning skyscraper, a little girl was sleeping, waiting for her father to come home and read to her. The stakes of their survival, which for Madeline had been a selfish, primal instinct, suddenly expanded. It wasn't just her life on the line. It was his. And it was Daisy's chance to see her father again. "We're going to make it," she said, surprising herself with the conviction in her own voice. "You're going to read her that story." A grim smile touched Tyler's lips, visible for a second in the fire's flickering light. "That's the plan." They were just passing the 25th floor when it happened. A sudden, violent jolt, far more severe than the others, threw them against the side of the cradle. The descent stopped. The scraping sound was replaced by an ominous, high-pitched creak as the cables strained under a dead weight. "What was that?" Madeline gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. "We're snagged," Tyler said, his voice tight. He worked the brake lever, pushing and pulling. But the cradle didn't move. It was held fast, suspended halfway down the building. He leaned out as far as he dared, trying to see what was holding them. "I can't see it. Something below us, a piece of the facade, maybe." They were stuck. The realization was a cold wave of dread. Below them, the street was still a terrifying distance away. Above them, the fire was growing, a hungry beast eating its way down the building's spine. They were a sitting target. "Okay," Tyler said, pulling himself back in. His calm demeanor was finally starting to fray at the edges. A muscle jumped in his jaw. "Okay, we have to shift the weight. Try to rocket free." "Rocket?" Madeline stared at him. "Are you crazy? We'll fall. We'll fall if we stay here and the cables melt," he countered, his logic unassailable. "I need you to move to my side. On 3, slowly, no sudden movements." She looked at him, then at the empty space on his side of the cradle, then down at the streetlights. So far away they looked like fallen stars. Her body refused to move. "Madeline," he said, his voice softer now, but more intense. "I need you to trust me. I'm not going to let you fall." She met his eyes, and in their depths, she saw not just determination, but a profound sense of responsibility. He wasn't just trying to save himself. He was trying to save her. The janitor she had mocked was putting his life on the line for her, and he was asking for her trust. She took a deep, shuddering breath and nodded. "Okay, on 3. 1, 2, 3. She moved, a slow, deliberate shuffle, her hands never leaving the rail. The cradle groaned in protest, tilting at a horrifying angle. She reached his side, pressing herself against him, her body trembling uncontrollably. "Now," he grunted, "we lean." Together, they pushed their weight against the side of the cradle. It swung out, away from the building, then back in, hitting the glass with a jarring thud. "Nothing." "Again," he commanded. They leaned again, harder this time. The cradle swung out, a pendulum over the abyss, and slammed back against the building. A loud crack echoed around them, followed by a metallic screech. The cradle dropped. It wasn't a slide this time. It was a fall. A sickening, weightless plunge of 10, maybe 15 feet. Madeline screamed, a raw, primal sound of pure terror. Tyler threw his body against the brake lever with a desperate roar. For one horrifying second, it didn't catch. Then, with a sound like a gunshot, the brake engaged. The cradle jerked to a halt so violent it nearly threw them both out. Their descent arrested once more, leaving them swinging in the smoky wind, 20 stories above the ground. For a long, breathless moment, they just swung, suspended in the night. The violent halt had sent a shockwave through the metal frame of the cradle, and it continued to tremble, a living thing terrified of its own predicament. Below them, the world was a dizzying swirl of flashing lights. Above, the fire raged, a malevolent orange eye staring down at them. Madeline was plastered against Tyler, her face buried in his shoulder, her body racked with tremors that had nothing to do with the cold. The scream had torn itself from her throat, leaving it raw and bleeding. She was gasping for air, each breath a painful, ragged sob. Tyler didn't move. He kept his body pressed against the brake lever, his entire weight holding it in place, his knuckles white. He was listening, not to Madeline's panicked gasps, but to the cradle itself, to the high-pitched pinging of the over-tightened cables, to the groan of the brake mechanism that had just saved their lives. "It held," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. The brake held. Madeline lifted her head slowly, her eyes wide and unfocused. She looked at him, then at the lever he was still pinning with his body. There was a dark, spreading stain on the shoulder of his gray overalls where he'd thrown himself against the steel. "You're bleeding," she whispered, her voice stripped of all its former ice, leaving only a fragile, human core. He glanced down, his expression unreadable. "It's nothing, just a bruise." He slowly, carefully began to release the pressure on the lever. The cradle gave a terrifying lurch, dropping another 6 inches with a sickening clank before catching again. He froze, his entire body rigid. "Okay," He breathed out. Okay, the gear is stripped. It'll hold our weight, but it won't release smoothly anymore. What does that mean? She asked, her voice shaking. It means the next 20 floors are going to be a series of short, controlled drops, he said, his gaze fixed on the mechanism. It's going to be rough. Rougher than before. She just stared at him. He had a gash on his shoulder. His face was a mask of soot and sweat. And he was talking about continuing their insane descent as if it were a minor inconvenience. She could see the emergency vehicles below now, swarming the base of the building like insects. She could make out the tiny figures of firefighters and police officers. They were so close. And yet, 20 stories might as well have been a mile. They see us, she said, a new fragile hope rising in her chest. Look, they see us! On the street below, a commotion was erupting. Spotlights swiveled up, pinning their tiny, swinging cage in cones of brilliant white light. A collective gasp seemed to rise from the crowd that had gathered behind the police barricades. They were a spectacle. A news helicopter was already hovering at a safe distance, its camera a single, unblinking eye. That's good, Tyler said, though his voice was tight with strain. But they can't get to us up here. The ladders don't reach this high. We have to get ourselves down. He looked at her, his eyes cutting through the chaos. I need you to get back to your side of the cradle. We have to balance the weight. The thought of letting go of him, of moving in their fragile cage, was terrifying. But the trust she'd given him 20 floors above had solidified into something hard and real. He hadn't let her fall. She nodded, her movement stiff and clumsy, and shuffled back to her side. Okay, he said, taking a firm grip on the lever. I'm going to release it and try to catch it again almost immediately. It's going to feel like we're falling. Don't scream. It won't help. Ready? She wasn't ready. She would never be ready. But she braced herself, gripping the rail, and gave a single, sharp nod. He pulled the lever. The world dropped out from under them. It was a 5-foot plunge of pure, heart-stopping terror. Madeline bit down on her lip so hard she tasted blood, stifling the scream that clawed at her throat. The cradle hit the end of its slack with a bone-jarring slam that rattled her teeth. Then Tyler, with a pained grunt, re-engaged the brake. They came to another shuddering halt. They were 5 feet closer to the ground. See? He panted, his voice strained. It works. That was your plan, she asked, her voice incredulous. To fall down the building? The plan is to survive, he shot back. It's all we've got. And so began the most terrifying journey of her life. A descent measured not in feet or floors, but in a series of controlled heart attacks. Drop, slam, halt. The rhythm was brutal, punishing. With each drop, the building rushed up to meet them. With each halt, their bodies were thrown against the steel cage. But with each one, the sirens got louder, the flashing lights grew brighter, and the shouts from the street below became more distinct. Somewhere around the 10th floor, Tyler's strength began to flag. She could see the tremors in his arms as he fought the lever, the sheer, brute force it took to arrest their fall each time. The gash on his shoulder was bleeding more freely now, the dark patch growing larger. Let me help, she said. He shook his head, his jaw clenched. No, I have a feel for it. You could overcorrect. Tyler, you're hurt. You can't do this alone. I have to, he said, his words clipped. He took a deep breath, braced himself, and pulled the lever again. Drop, slam, halt. 8th floor, 7th. They could see the faces of the firefighters now, upturned and anxious. A ladder was being extended from a massive truck, its arm reaching, but it was still too short. Just a little more, Tyler muttered, more to himself than to her. Come on, just a little more. He pulled the lever. They dropped to the 6th floor, then the 5th. The top of the ladder was almost parallel with them now, a tantalizing 10 feet away. A firefighter in full gear was climbing, a safety line clipped to his belt. One more, Tyler grunted, his face pale with exhaustion. This is the last one. He pulled the lever with the last of his strength. The cradle dropped, and this time, something was different. A high-pitched screech accompanied the fall, and the cradle didn't just drop, it tilted, one side dipping precariously as a cable finally gave way. They weren't just falling, They were tipping over. Tyler threw himself against the brake, not with control, but with raw, desperate force. The gear caught with a final grinding shriek of protest, and then shattered, but not before arresting their fall one last time. The cradle hung there, suspended at a sickening angle, a broken toy dangling by a single thread, level with the fourth floor. And just 5 feet away, a firefighter on the end of the ladder reached out his hand. "I've got you!" he yelled, his voice muffled by his mask. "Give me your hand!" The firefighter's voice was a lifeline thrown across a chasm of chaos. "Give me your hand!" The cradle, hanging at a nauseating angle, gave another metallic groan. The last remaining cable, stretched taut and gleaming in the spotlights, was singing a high, thin song of imminent failure. "You first," Tyler said, his voice a low command directed at Madeline. His body was wedged into the low corner of the tilted cage, acting as a human counterweight. She stared at him, then at the firefighter's outstretched glove, then back at Tyler. "No, you're hurt. You go." The words were out of her mouth before she could think, a reflexive, protective instinct she didn't know she possessed. Leaving him behind felt like a physical impossibility, a violation of the unspoken pact they had forged in fire and fear. "That's an order, Shaw," Tyler grunted, the name a strange echo of their disastrous date. "I'm heavier. If I move first, the balance will shift and send you swinging out of reach. You have to go now." "He's right, ma'am," the firefighter yelled, his voice urgent. "That thing's not going to hold." "We need to move." As if to punctuate his words, a strand of the steel cable snapped with a sound like a rifle shot. The cradle dropped another foot, swinging wildly. Madeline screamed, her grip on the rail the only thing keeping her from being thrown out. That was it. The debate was over. Fear, sharp and absolute, made the decision for her. "Go!" Tyler roared. She didn't think. She scrambled over the tilted edge of the cradle, reaching across the terrifying gap. The firefighter grabbed her wrist, his grip like a vice. For a heart-stopping second, she was suspended between the broken cradle and the ladder, her feet dangling over the street below. He hauled her across, pulling her into the relative safety of the ladder's rungs. She collapsed against him, her body a dead weight, her legs refusing to hold her. "Gotcha," the firefighter said, his arm a solid bar around her waist. "You're safe now. Just hold on." But she wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on Tyler. He was still in the cradle, alone, preparing to move. He looked impossibly small and vulnerable against the backdrop of the burning building. He met her gaze. For a fraction of a second, the world fell away. The sirens, the shouts, the roaring fire, and there was only the silent, desperate communication between them. He gave her a single, sharp nod. "I'm coming." Then he moved. He didn't climb. He launched himself, a powerful, desperate leap from the tilting edge of the cradle toward the ladder. It was a movement of pure, explosive force. The last of his reserves poured into a single life-or-death gamble. He was in midair when the final cable snapped. It parted with a deafening final crack. The cradle, free of its last restraint, plunged toward the earth. It fell in eerie silence for a moment, before crashing onto the street below with a cataclysmic, bone-shattering impact of twisting metal and shattering safety glass that echoed through the canyon of buildings. Madeline screamed his name, a raw, ragged sound of loss, but his fingers had found the ladder. He was clinging to a rung, his body swinging violently. The firefighter, reacting with lightning speed, grabbed the back of his overalls, pulling him securely onto the ladder just as his grip began to fail. "I've got him!" the firefighter yelled down. "He's okay." They're both okay. A roar went up from the street below, a wave of collective, vicarious relief from the hundreds of people watching the real-life drama unfold. Tyler sagged against the ladder, his head hung low, his body finally surrendering to the crushing weight of exhaustion. He had made it. They both had. The descent down the ladder was a blur. The closer they got to the ground, the more the reality of their situation crashed in on them. The air was thick with smoke and the shouts of emergency personnel. The heat from the building was a blast furnace, even from 100 feet away. When their feet finally touched solid ground, it felt unsteady, alien. A team of paramedics immediately swarmed them, separating them, their voices a barrage of professional, urgent questions. Someone wrapped a thick wool blanket around Madeline's shoulders. Another paramedic was shining a light into Tyler's eyes. They were in the heart of a controlled whirlwind. Police officers were pushing back reporters, firefighters were shouting orders, and the noise was a physical thing, pressing in from all sides. Amid the chaos, Madeline's eyes found his. He was sitting on the bumper of an ambulance, a paramedic trying to assess the wound on his shoulder. He looked exhausted, broken, and more heroic than any man she had ever met. He looked up, and for a moment, their gazes locked across the chaos. In that look, 1,000 things were said without a single word. Gratitude, disbelief, a shared trauma that had irrevocably bonded them. She saw the quiet janitor, the brave soldier, the man who had climbed back into hell for a woman who had shown him nothing but contempt. And he saw not the ruthless CEO, but the terrified woman he had pulled from the fire, the person whose life he had inexplicably, irrevocably tied to his own. She took a step toward him, 100 questions on her lips. "Tyler, But a paramedic gently but firmly guided her toward a different ambulance. "Ma'am, we need to get you to the hospital. You're in shock, and that foot needs to be looked at." Another paramedic was tending to Tyler. "Sir, we need your name for our records." "Tyler Holt," he said, his voice hoarse. "Any family we should contact?" the medic asked, wrapping a pressure bandage around his shoulder. The question seemed to bring Tyler back to himself. His eyes, which had been dazed, suddenly sharpened. His entire posture changed. The soldier and the survivor vanished, replaced by something far more powerful. The father. "My daughter," he said, his voice thick with a new urgency. "Daisy, I need to call her sitter. I have to let them know I'm okay." He fumbled for his wallet, his hands shaking. "I have to get to my daughter." Madeline heard him. And in that moment, she finally understood. His courage wasn't for her. It wasn't about some abstract code of honor. It was all for that little girl. Everything he did, from working a job he hated to climbing a burning building, was for Daisy. His quiet life, the one she had mocked as unfulfilling, was in fact the most fulfilled life she had ever encountered. It was a life built on a foundation of pure, unconditional love. And the realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, leaving her breathless. "We have to go, ma'am," her paramedic said, guiding her into the ambulance. "Wait," she protested, looking back at Tyler. "I need to talk to him." But it was too late. The doors of her ambulance were closing, shutting him out. Through the rear window, she watched as they loaded him into his own ambulance. Her last image was of him, sitting on the gurney, his head in his hands, not from pain or exhaustion, but from the overwhelming, desperate need to get back to his child. The ambulance pulled away, its siren joining the cacophony of the city, and she was alone, speeding into the night. A profound, aching sense of unfinished business settling deep in her soul. The inside of the ambulance was a world away from the chaos on the street. It was clean, brightly lit, and smelled of antiseptic. A paramedic with kind, tired eyes was cleaning the gash on Madeline's foot. The pain was a dull, distant throb, overshadowed by the roaring in her ears and the tremor in her hands that she couldn't seem to stop. The wool blanket felt heavy, a pathetic shield against a cold that was radiating from the inside out. At the hospital, the motion was swift and impersonal. She was moved from the ambulance to a gurney, from the gurney to a brightly lit emergency bay. Nurses and doctors moved around her, their voices a calm, professional murmur. They asked questions she couldn't quite process. "Are you allergic to anything? Can you tell me your date of birth? Does this hurt?" She answered on autopilot, her mind a million miles away, replaying the last few hours in a dizzying, terrifying loop. The crawl space, the burning office, the fall, the final, desperate leap. Over and over she saw Tyler's face, calm in the face of chaos, resolute, determined. And then his face as he sat on the bumper of the ambulance, the heroics forgotten, his entire being consumed with a single thought: Daisy. A doctor was stitching her foot, his movements neat and precise. "You were very lucky," he said, his eyes focused on his work. "A few more minutes up there. Well, you're a very lucky woman, Miss Shaw. Lucky." The word felt wrong. Luck had nothing to do with it. She was alive because of a man she had deemed worthless. A man whose name she had barely bothered to remember until he was the only thing between her and death. A hot flush of shame, so intense it was almost nauseating, crept up her neck. Her own words from the restaurant echoed in her head, sharp and cruel. "How fulfilling. Enjoy your janitorial duties." "I need my phone," she said suddenly, her voice raspy. A nurse looked up from an IV bag. "We can try to locate your personal items, ma'am, but right now you need to rest." "I don't need to rest," Madeline insisted, pushing herself up on her elbows. The movement sent a wave of dizziness through her. "I need my phone. And I need to know what hospital they took the other man to. The man who was with me." Tyler Holt. The nurse gave her a placating smile. "We'll make some calls. Just try to relax." Meanwhile, in a different bay, in the same sprawling emergency room, Tyler was refusing treatment. "It's just a deep bruise and a laceration, Mr. Holt," the doctor said patiently. "But it needs to be properly cleaned and dressed, and I want to get you a tetanus shot." "Just patch it up so I can go," Tyler said, his voice raw with exhaustion and anxiety. "I need to get home." He'd already borrowed a nurse's phone to make the most important call of his life. The sound of Mrs. Gable's voice, calm and steady, had been the first solid thing he'd felt since the explosion. Daisy was still asleep, blissfully unaware. He'd told the sitter there had been a minor incident at work, that he was fine but would be home later than usual. The lie had tasted like ash in his mouth. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they released him. His gray overalls were gone, replaced by a set of standard-issue hospital scrubs. His shoulder was bandaged, his face was clean, and he felt like a ghost. He took a cab home, the pre-dawn sky beginning to lighten in the east. When he quietly let himself into his small apartment, Mrs. Gable was waiting for him. "Oh, Tyler," she whispered, her eyes taking in his appearance. "I'm okay," he said, his voice cracking. "Is she—" "Fast asleep," she said softly. He walked past her, down the short hallway to Daisy's room, and pushed the door open a crack. In the soft glow of her dinosaur nightlight, he could see her small form, curled up under her blankets, her breathing slow and even. She was safe. The sight of her, so peaceful and untouched by the night's horror, finally broke him. A deep, shuddering breath escaped him, and he leaned his forehead against the doorframe, the strength that had carried him through the last 6 hours draining out of him all at once. In her private hospital room, Madeline was watching the news. Her face was on every channel. A grainy cell phone video showed the cradle's terrifying descent. A news helicopter's thermal imaging showed the fire gutting the upper floors of her building. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "CEO trapped in blaze, rescued in daring escape." Then they showed his picture. It was a low-quality security camera still from the lobby, showing a man in a janitor's uniform. "The hero of the night," the news anchor was saying, "is being identified as Tyler Holt, a night shift janitor and former U.S. Army soldier." She watched, her heart a leaden weight in her chest, as they detailed his bravery. And all she could think about was the way she had looked at him in that restaurant, with nothing but pity and contempt. She had to see him. It was a need so sharp and urgent it eclipsed everything else. An apology wasn't enough. She didn't know what she wanted to say, but she knew she had to say it to his face. She called her assistant. "Find out where Tyler Holt lives," she said, her voice clear and firm, "and have a car ready for me in an hour. I'm checking myself out." An hour later, there was a soft knock on Tyler's door. He opened it a few inches, expecting reporters. It was Madeline. She stood in the dim hallway of his apartment building, looking as out of place as a diamond in a toolbox. She wore simple trousers and a soft sweater. Her hair was pulled back, her face pale, and one of her feet was in a bulky medical boot. She was holding a large, steaming cup of coffee. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice weary. I had to. I brought you coffee. She held out the cup. He didn't take it. I don't drink coffee, he said, the words a faint echo of their date. Her face fell. Oh, right. I'm sorry. Can I come in, please? He stepped back, opening the door wider. She walked in, her eyes taking in his small, tidy apartment. I don't know what to say, she began, her voice trembling. Thank you it's not enough. You saved my life. Anyone would have done the same, he said. No, she insisted, her voice sharp with conviction. They wouldn't have. I was wrong about everything. I need you to know that I see you now. I see you. A small sound from the hallway made them both turn. Daisy stood there, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, her pink dinosaur pajamas rumpled. Daddy? She said, her voice small. Who's that? The tension in the room instantly vanished. Tyler knelt, opening his arms. Hey, sweet pea, come here. Daisy ran to him, burying her face in his good shoulder. He stood up, holding her. This is a friend, Daisy, Tyler said. Her name is Madeline. Hi, Daisy said shyly. Hi, Daisy, Madeline replied, her voice thick with emotion. She looked at the two of them. A perfect, unbreachable unit. She finally understood. He hadn't been saving her. He'd been fighting his way back to this. Are you the princess Daddy met? Daisy asked. Madeline's breath caught. She looked at Tyler. A faint flush crept up his neck. You have a castle? Daisy pressed on. Madeline managed a small, watery smile. I did, she said softly, but it burned down. The simple, honest answer seemed to satisfy the little girl. Madeline knew it was time to go. She was an intruder here. She placed the untouched coffee cup on a small table. I should go. I'm sorry again for everything. Her hand was on the doorknob when Tyler's voice stopped her. Madeline! She turned back. He was still holding Daisy, his face etched with exhaustion. You were right about one thing, he said. It is a fulfilling job. She looked at him, at the fierce, protective love he had for his daughter, and she finally, truly understood. Yes, she said, her voice cracking. It is. She opened the door and walked out, leaving him in the quiet sanctuary of his home, the first rays of morning sun finally reaching her face. The city was still there. Her empire, or what was left of it, was waiting. But for the first time in a very long time, she felt like she was walking toward something real. The next morning, Tyler woke up on the couch to the sound of Daisy's giggles. He opened his eyes, every muscle screaming in protest, to see her sitting on the floor, surrounded by a mountain of brightly colored building blocks. The news was on the television, the volume low, but the image was unmistakable. The Obsidian Point, a smoking wound in the city skyline. The movie is still on, Daddy, Daisy said cheerfully. Tyler reached for the remote and clicked the screen to black. He couldn't protect her from the knowledge of what happened forever, but he could for a little while longer. The peace was shattered by a knock on the door, louder and more insistent than Madeline's had been. He looked through the peephole and his blood ran cold. It was a reporter, a woman with a microphone, and a cameraman was setting up behind her. They had found him. His phone began to buzz incessantly. Old army buddies, former neighbors, even his ex-wife had seen his face on the news. He ignored them all. He was in survival mode again, but this time, the threat wasn't fire. It was fame. By noon, 2 more news vans had arrived. His quiet residential street had been turned into a media circus. He was a prisoner in his own home. The final straw came when his doorbell rang again. The reporter was holding out a checkbook. Mr. Holt? My name is Cynthia Davies from Channel 8. We'd love to offer you a significant sum for an exclusive interview. He backed away from the door, a helpless, suffocating anger rising in his chest. He had to get Daisy out of here. But where could they go? His phone rang, an unlisted number. He almost ignored it, but something made him answer. It's Madeline. I saw the news, she said, her voice tight with an anger that was clearly on his behalf. The reporters. I am so sorry, Tyler. This is my fault. It's not your fault, he said tiredly. It's what they do. No, it's my fault because my profile is what's attracting them to you, she countered. And I'm going to fix it. I've retained a team. They're the best. They can be there in an hour. They will make this go away. But they can't act without your permission. Tyler's first instinct was to refuse. His pride, fierce and stubborn, rose in his throat. He didn't need her help. He didn't want her money. We don't need anything, he said, the words automatic. This isn't for you, she said, her voice softening but losing none of its intensity. This is for Daisy. Think about her, Tyler. She can't play outside. She can't go to school. She's a prisoner in her own home because of a choice I made, and a choice you made. You chose to save me. Let me choose to protect your daughter's childhood. Please. He closed his eyes. She had aimed her argument at the one weak point in his armor. He looked into the living room. Daisy was holding up a drawing for him to see. It was a picture of a smiling janitor next to a princess with a gold crown. The fight went out of him. Okay, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Okay, Madeline. For Daisy. The team that arrived was not what he expected. A calm, silver-haired man in a tweed jacket and a sharp-eyed woman in a pantsuit knocked quietly on his door. Within minutes of their arrival, they spoke in low, confidential tones to the reporters, handing each a thick, official-looking document. The news crews packed up and left without argument. The street fell silent. The siege was over. The silver-haired man, Quentin, knocked again. It's done, Mr. Holt. Ms. Shaw's instructions were very clear. Your peace and your daughter's security are the only priority. He handed Tyler a simple white card with a phone number on it, and then they were gone. Tyler closed the door, the silence of his apartment feeling profound. He had just witnessed a display of power more absolute than any weapon. He felt a complicated, unsettling mix of relief and resentment. Is the movie over, Daddy? Daisy asked. Tyler looked at her, and the resentment melted away, leaving only relief. He knelt and scooped her into his arms. Yep, movie's over, sweet pea. In her hotel suite, Madeline was fighting a different kind of battle. The preliminary report from the independent auditors had landed. The fire suppression systems had failed because the primary power controllers were cheap, foreign-made counterfeits. It wasn't an accident. It was a betrayal. It was an act of greed so profound it was indistinguishable from murder. The thought sent a chill down her spine. The shared trauma was no longer a random event. She felt an overwhelming urge to warn him. She found herself dialing his number without a conscious thought. It's Madeline, she said when he answered. The fire, it might not have been an accident. He listened as she explained. He felt no surprise, only a weary, sinking feeling of recognition. Your address is public record now, she continued, her voice urgent. Whoever did this might see you as a loose end, a way to get to me. A cold dread crept up his spine. He looked at Daisy, who was humming to herself as she set up a tea party for her teddy bears. What do you want me to do, Madeline? He asked. I want you to let me help, she pleaded. I own a property an hour north of the city. There's a guest house. It's small, quiet, and behind a gate. No one would ever find you there. Please, do this for Daisy. She deserves a place where she can play outside without you having to look over your shoulder. He was already shaking his head, his pride rebelling. I can't accept that. Don't think of it as accepting anything, she said quickly. Think of it as a strategic relocation, a safe house, until this is over. He looked at his daughter, laughing as she poured imaginary tea. Madeline had aimed her argument at the one weak point in his armor. He closed his eyes, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a grim, reluctant acceptance. His life in this small apartment was over. Okay, he said, the word tasting like defeat and surrender. For Daisy. The guest house was from another world. It was a small two-bedroom cottage built of old stone and warm wood, nestled in a grove of oak trees a quarter-mile from the main estate house, which was a distant, scaffold-covered silhouette. A small stream gurgled nearby. For the first time in days, the only sounds were the wind in the trees and the cheerful chirps of birds. Daisy fell in love with it instantly. For her, it wasn't a safe house. It was a fairy tale cottage. She ran through the small, beautifully furnished rooms, claiming the one with a window seat that looked out over a wildflower meadow. For the first time since the fire, Tyler saw the genuine, uncomplicated joy return to his daughter's face. The knot of tension in his own chest, a knot he hadn't even realized was there, began to loosen. Madeline had been true to her word. A car had picked them up discreetly from the back of his apartment building. They had arrived with nothing but a few hastily packed bags, but the guest house was fully stocked. The pantry was full. The closets held new, simple clothes in their sizes, and the bookshelf in Daisy's room was filled with classic children's stories. The generosity was staggering, and it made Tyler deeply uncomfortable. He felt like a kept man, a project. But every time he looked at Daisy, running barefoot through the soft grass outside, her laughter echoing in the clean country air, his pride dissolved. Madeline had been right. This wasn't for him. It was for her. 3 days later, Madeline's car crunched up the gravel driveway. Tyler was on the small porch, watching Daisy try to catch butterflies. He stood up as Madeline got out of the car. She wasn't dressed like a CEO. She wore jeans, a simple white shirt, and a pair of riding boots. She looked younger, less formidable. "Hi," she said, her voice a little hesitant. She was holding a small, brightly wrapped gift. "Hi," he replied. The awkwardness of their new reality hung between them. He was a guest, or a charity case, on her land. Daisy, seeing the visitor, ran over. "It's the princess!" she squealed. A faint blush colored Madeline's cheeks. "Hi, Daisy. I brought you something." She handed the gift to the little girl. It was a beautiful, professional-grade sketch pad and a set of colored pencils. "Wow, thank you." Daisy hugged Madeline's legs, a gesture of pure, unthinking affection that seemed to startle the CEO. Madeline stood rigidly for a moment before her hand came down to rest, awkwardly at first, on Daisy's hair. "You're welcome," she said, her voice a little thick. They spent the afternoon in a strange, tentative dance of normalcy. Daisy showed Madeline her new room and the drawing she'd made of a butterfly. Madeline, in turn, showed a surprising knowledge of different butterfly species. They walked down to the stream, and Tyler watched as Madeline Shaw, the corporate raider who brought titans of industry to their knees, knelt in the dirt to help his daughter build a small dam out of pebbles and twigs. Later, after Daisy had gone inside to draw in her new sketch pad, they sat on the porch. "I found him," Madeline said, her voice low and hard. The change was immediate. The soft afternoon persona vanished, replaced by the CEO. "It was my COO, Henderson. He was in deep with some very bad people. Gambling debts. Vector Systems was a shell company they used to funnel money. He signed off on the counterfeit parts to cover his tracks. He knew they were substandard, but he never thought they'd fail so catastrophically. He thought he was just skimming a few million off the top." "What happens to him now?" Tyler asked. "He's in federal custody." "He'll be in prison for the rest of his life," she said, her voice devoid of triumph. She just sounded tired. "It's over, Tyler. The threat is gone. You're safe." The words should have been a relief, a release, but instead, they felt like an eviction notice. He was free to go. He could pack up their bags, thank her for her charity, and go back. But go back to what? The small apartment now felt like a cage. His job as a janitor, once a source of quiet stability, now felt like a life he had outgrown. The fire had burned away more than just a building. It had burned away the man he used to be. "So, we'll be out of your hair in the morning," he said, the words tasting like gravel. Madeline turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Is that what you want?" "It's your house," he said, looking away, out at the trees. "It's a house," she corrected him gently. "It's just property. It's not a home." She paused. "I spend my life acquiring things, Tyler. Buildings, companies, assets. I thought that's what building a life meant. I never understood that a life is something you build with people. The way you have with Daisy." She stood up and walked to the edge of the porch. "I'm selling Shaw Industries," she said quietly. "Or what's left of it. I'm done. I want to build something else. Something that matters." She turned back to face him. "This estate, it's been in my family for generations, but it's been neglected. The grounds are overgrown, the main house needs a complete overhaul. The machinery in the barns hasn't run in 20 years. It needs a caretaker, someone who knows how things work, someone who knows how to fix things that are broken. She was offering him a job, a life. Not out of pity, not out of debt, but because she saw him, his skills, his character, and she valued them. "I don't need charity, Madeline," he said, his voice rough with pride. "This isn't charity," she countered, her eyes meeting his. "This is a partnership. I'm good at making plans and finding resources. You're good at making things real. We could rebuild this place. Together." He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the woman from the restaurant, the woman from the fire, the woman who knelt in the dirt with his daughter. They were all the same person, someone who had been trapped in a tower of her own making long before the fire ever started. He thought of his life before the fire, a life of quiet survival, of keeping his head down. He had survived, but he hadn't truly been living. The fire had changed that. It had forced him to be more than just a janitor, more than just a father. It had forced him to be the man he was always meant to be. A year later, the guest house was still their home. The main house on the hill was slowly coming back to life, its windows no longer dark and empty. From the porch, Tyler could hear the distant, happy shrieks of Daisy playing in the meadow with her two new best friends, a golden retriever puppy and Madeline. He was wearing grease-stained jeans and an old t-shirt, his hands calloused from work he loved. He spent his days restoring the estate's old machinery, his nights reading stories to his daughter, and his weekends in a quiet, comfortable companionship with a woman who was slowly, carefully, learning how to build a home instead of an empire. Madeline looked up from the meadow and saw him watching. She smiled, a real, unguarded smile that reached her eyes. He smiled back. They were two survivors, scarred and changed by the fire, who had found something unexpected in the ashes. They had learned that true strength wasn't about the heights you could climb, but about having the courage to climb back down. It wasn't about invulnerability. It was about the quiet, fulfilling work of rebuilding, piece by piece, a life worth living. Together. And that's a wrap on this story. But the conversation doesn't have to end here. Let us know down below what part of the world this reached today, and maybe one word that says how it made you feel. It's incredible to think we're creating this sort of map of emotions together. What we're trying to do here is build a home for stories that actually matter. Stories about getting back up, about forgiveness, and that quiet kind of strength. If you want to help us build it, a subscription and a simple like goes a very long way. It tells the world that these stories are wanted, and it helps them travel to places we could never reach alone. I'm just so grateful you chose to spend your time here. Until we meet in another tale, try to be the kindness you want to see out there.